Hi, modern dancers. Hope you're all doing well still. We are doing a little bit something different for the next few videos. Rather than give you something physical to work on, I wanted to do a deep dive into some of the modern choreographers and modern dances that we talked about. I know I've talked for 2 years now about how I wish I had more time to give you more insight to modern dance history and to the choreographers that kind of made our style what it is today. And we never have time, we always have something going on. So now that we're at home and maybe you have a little extra time, a little downtime, I thought it would be a good idea to really start understanding modern dance and what it actually is, and understanding its history and why it is the way that it is. So, and I encourage you to move after watching this session, and I'm gonna suggest you watch a couple different videos that will kind of help maybe influence you in how you move when you try some of these things that we're going to talk about. So the first person that we're going to talk about today, or the one person we're going to talk about today, her name is Isadora Duncan, and a lot of people consider her the mother of dance. Now, dance has existed for centuries before her, and she didn't necessarily create anything new, but she really made modern dance a thing, and especially in America. So up until the turn of the century, about early 1900s, ballet was king. You saw ballet everywhere, especially in the opera houses in Europe, in Russia. It was huge. And ballet did exist in the United States. It was popular, it was big, but as you may have noticed with Americans, we tend to do things a little differently, and we tend to put our own mark on the things that we do. And this is no different. So when you look at the turn of the century, we have in America, we have ballet, but we only have that in the large cities. When you think about some of the things that we talked about in class, it took money to go to the theater. It took money to especially go see dance. And that is not something that, as we know today, that's not something that everybody has the time and the money to just go do. So it was limited to the larger cities. And then we also had something called vaudeville. And vaudeville was touring groups, kind of almost in a way like a circus tours. So you would have performers that would perform at different fairs, different public gatherings to make money. And it was really based off of people could sing, people could dance, people could do magic. They kind of those freak sideshows that we've seen in movies and in television, the bearded lady and all of that. So that was kind of vaudeville, and they would go around and they would perform, and that was how they would make their living. So those were really our two main outlets for dance in America at the turn of the century. Isadora, she was born in late 1800s. I think it was 1877. Could be wrong about that, but double check. But she was born in California, and she grew up dancing. So she learned, we don't really know how she learned. We don't have that specific information, but we know that she did train in ballet, and that she did start teaching at an earlier age. But one thing that made her different is that she was very interested in improvisation and moving how it felt good to her. So following fantasy is what I've heard a lot of people refer to her teaching as. And she continued to dance and teach. And when she was in her 20s, she moved to Chicago. And from Chicago, she eventually ended up in New York. And that's where she really started seriously training for ballet. And she wasn't impressed by the ballet scene. She felt that there was so much more there for her in dance than just ballet, than just dressing in a pretty dress to tell a story about some maiden that needed to be rescued by some prince. So she eventually ended up moving to Europe, and she was inspired there by a lot of the ancient art that was in the museums that she was able to tour. So in particularly Greek art. We don't have a lot of physical 3D sculpture from Greece, but we have a lot of paintings, and we have a lot of vases, so Greek vases that depict what we think she drew a lot of her ideas from. So a lot of times when you see Isadora dancing, she is dressed very almost as though she's in a toga, very Grecian style. And she felt that the body should not be reprimanded by a corset and by all of the layers that women were wearing then. She felt that the body was meant to move and meant to carry us from one place to another and carry us through different life scenarios. And why should we be hindered by all of these layers? It wasn't meant to be that way, she felt. And so as she continued to dance and she met new people and met artists, and that's what she continued to really push, is that we need looser clothing, fuller movement. And she worked with another famous modern dancer named Loie Fuller. And she's a fun one to look up too. Loie was very popular, and she was known for her use of fabric. So if you Google Loie, Loie, Fuller, Fuller, and you will see pictures of her, and she is just covered in fabric. And she was different because she wasn't dancing in a corset. But she was still covered with all of this fabric. And that was a lot of what she liked to do, was take the fabric and use it with her motions. And so Isadora had worked with her, and she was inspired by that and thought that was really neat. But she took it a step further, and instead of continuing to cover herself, she decided, why cover myself with fabric? I can use my legs, I can use my arms, and there's nothing wrong with showing and exposing those body parts. She also, one of the things that you'll really hear about Isadora is that she believed that your soul comes from your solar plexus. So kind of right about here is your solar plexus. So it's kind of where your rib cage stops, and it's kind of where the hard meets the soft in your body. And that's your solar plexus area. And she really believed that that is where your soul came from, and that every movement in life should be guided by your soul. Therefore, it should be guided by your solar plexus. So as she taught, she eventually grew into her technique grew into this idea that all of these movements were precipitated by movement from your chest, movement from your soul. And that was something that had never been taught before. And so we've got a woman who is not wearing the traditional garments of the day. And not only that, but she is not as well covered as most women were in those times. It was acceptable for a ballet dancer to wear tights and a leotard and a tutu, the things that we see now. That was acceptable because you were portraying a character, and normally it was a character that was very demure and very helpless and soft. You know, it was typically a fairy or a woman, a princess that needed saving. So they were very, very vulnerable. It was nothing racy or anything inappropriate. Where Isadora was saying, it's not inappropriate to show my arms. It's not inappropriate to show my legs. It's not inappropriate to not wear a corset. This is our body. There's nothing to be shamed about. It is what it is, and why can't we use it and show it? Why are we fearful of it? So she eventually went on to open some schools that taught this idea throughout Europe. Unfortunately, most of them closed by the time World War I came around. But she did have two children. She's also had a tragic life. She had two children who eventually, unfortunately, drowned. They were with their nanny, and they were in a car that slid off an embankment and fell into a river, and the children drowned, unfortunately, and that was in 1913. And Isadora really struggled with that. And through teaching and opening her schools, she actually unofficially adopted 6 girls that she taught. The adoptions were never fully legalized, but the girls changed their last name to Fuller, and they considered Isadora to be their mother. And they are, the reason I bring that up is they are the reason that this idea that Isadora has still exists today. If you were to look at a dance family tree of ballet, it would be a lot of branches, and it would take you a really long time to get back to where ballet started. With modern, it's similar. Modern's newer, so our family tree wouldn't be as big. But when you look at the Isadora Duncan branch, it's very, very easy to see. There's only about 5 generations. So it would be Isadora and then the 6 adopted daughters, and they really held on to that and continued to teach it. And even today, you can see the specific names of the people that have really continued to teach Isadora Duncan's ideas and her processes. Which you can't say that for every single modern choreographer, because it's just not that well documented. And these people that continue on with Isadora's legacy, it's very meaningful to them, and it means it's important. So unfortunately, she also had a very tragic ending. Most people, if they know who Isadora Duncan is, they have heard that she's the mother of dance, and they have heard about her death. She was in France in 1927, I believe, and she was getting ready to leave a friend's house. Her friend had insisted that she should wear a coat because it was chilly, and she said no, she didn't need a coat. She had a scarf on, so she had it wrapped over her hair and then around her neck, and that was pretty common. Think about what cars were looking like in the 1920s. A lot of them didn't have roofs. They were all permanent convertibles. So a lot of women wore scarves on their hair to keep their hair in place. And so that's what she was doing. Unfortunately, the tail of the scarf was hanging out of the car. And as the car accelerated and drove off, the tail of the scarf got wrapped around the wheel. And it pulled her out of the car, and the car ran her over. And some reports say that she died instantly. Others said that she died at the hospital. I don't think anyone quite knows. But unfortunately, a lot of the really great things that Isadora Duncan did for modern dance are overshadowed by her tragic death. I think it's important to know, and it's an interesting tidbit. I mean, I think you'll always remember that now, is Isadora Duncan and her death. But I think it's even more important to really realize that she was the start of why modern dance dropped all the fabric and dropped the corset and allowed women to dress more freely and not be ashamed of their bodies and not be worried about covering up every single little piece of them. That movement came from the solar plexus, the soul, that if we are to move, then everything should be done by what our soul tells us to do, whether we are dancing or whether we are making everyday choices in life. And I mean, that's really profound to think about, you know. Here's a woman who is not only changing how dancers dress, but also how dancers dance. She also, side note, she was never married. She had 2 children and she was never married, which was extremely taboo at that time. But she truly believed that if she was living and making choices, soulful choices, that she didn't need to be married. She was doing right by her soul, and she was a good person, and it didn't matter if she was married. And truly, we don't remember her for that. That's a very small side note, which is why I bring it up, because she was convinced that everything we do in life is driven by our soul, and all of our dancing is driven by our soul. And that really life in itself and dance were much more closely related and entwined on a day-to-day basis, more so than you would ever expect. So I think the main thing to remember is changing the idea of how we dress, and that it's okay to show an arm or a leg. It's okay not to wear a corset. It's okay to move freely. Embracing the idea that our body isn't shameful, that our body is meant to carry us through life, and that we should be proud of that. And that all of our movement comes from our solar plexus, and that all dance is regulated by the solar plexus, which is your soul. And I think those are the main points to take away. Everything that she wore when she danced was very Grecian themed as well. I think a lot of the videos that I will post for you to watch, or if you do a quick Google search, you'll also see that is very loose, almost toga-like fitted dresses. So I hope you learned something new today. I hope you enjoyed it. We will be focusing on actually 2 choreographers next week, and they also kind of tie into the person that we're going to be talking about the week after. So these 2 are also pretty influential at the turn of the century. So get excited for that. Go Google. Hope you're doing well, and I'll see you soon.